I see some familiar faces out there, but for those of you that don't know me, my name is Chris Sartain, and I am a CSA minister. Mr. Davis ordained me in 2012, July 5th, 2012, and I live now in southern Chile, where I run a meditation and yoga retreat center here in the Andes Mountains. And I'm the director of a yoga school along with my wife. And we offer yoga teacher trainings and yoga workshops. Today, I'd like to talk a little bit about the 8 limbs of yoga. I'm sure many of you are already familiar with the 8 limbs of Patanjali. But just in case, the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali is a very important text, not only in the Kriya Yoga tradition, but really in all yoga traditions. It was written, we think, about 200 years before Christ. So it's an ancient text. And in this Kriya Yoga tradition, it's very important because it really explains what Kriya Yoga is. And in addition, it gives us a step-by-step process that we can follow to experience yoga, samadhi, this experience of oneness consciousness that really is the aim of our yoga practice. In the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, yoga and samadhi are synonymous. So they mean the same thing. In other yoga texts, this isn't necessarily so. But definitely in the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, this word yoga is synonymous with the word samadhi, which is the aim of our yoga practice. And yoga or samadhi is sometimes translated as oneness, oneness consciousness, union. Or the union of our individual consciousness with supreme or infinite consciousness. And in the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, there's mention of 8 limbs of yoga. Ashtanga Yoga. And Ashtanga means 8 limbs. Okay? Sometimes people say the 8 steps of yoga, which is also okay, and I'll explain maybe the difference between referring to it as the 8 limbs or the 8 steps, and why there is a little bit of conflict there, discrepancy. The first 2 limbs are the Yamas and Niyamas. And these are a set of guidelines, of ethical and moral guidelines that we are to follow in our lives, in our day-to-day lives as yogis. In the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, Patanjali says that future karma is to be avoided, or future suffering is to be avoided. And these yamas and niyamas help us avoid future suffering and future drama, future conflict, future karma in our lives. which then helps us practice the rest of the steps more easily. There are some systems of yoga, for example, that say that we must perfect the yamas and niyamas before we can even begin to practice the rest of the steps of yoga. But that's quite the task. So not in our tradition, that is not the case. It is said that if we practice the yamas and niyamas to the best of our ability, that we will be able to meditate, practice the rest of the steps far more easily, because we will have less drama and less suffering and less karma in our lives to deal with, which will cause fewer distractions for us in the long run. So we practice the yamas and niyamas, which are the ethical and moral guidelines, in order to avoid future problems, future suffering, future karma, so that we can practice the rest of the steps of Patanjali more easily. Likewise, there's sort of a direct relationship between meditation and the yamas and niyamas. In other words, the more we practice meditation, the easier the yamas and niyamas are to follow. And eventually, it's automatic. So the more we meditate, and the more time and devotion we give to our sadhana, or spiritual practices, the easier the yamas and niyamas become for us to follow and practice in our day-to-day lives. So much so that eventually the yamas and niyamas become automatic, and there's no choice to be made. We do not have to choose to practice satya or ahimsa or brahmacharya or asteya or shaucha or any of these yamas and niyamas. They occur and unfold naturally in our day-to-day lives. And we don't have to choose between the devil on one shoulder and the angel on the other shoulder. It's just a natural process, and we begin to behave appropriately in every moment of every day. And so that our actions and behaviors are always appropriate. And so that's what the yamas and niyamas really are. An ethical guideline for us to follow so that we can avoid future problems in our lives and have a more peaceful, tranquil existence, so that we can practice the rest of the steps of Patanjali more easily. Now, the rest of the so-called limbs of Patanjali are steps. It is a logical sequence that we follow. There's an order, a logical order and a logical sequence to the rest of the limbs of Patanjali. So starting with asana, which is the third limb, that begins the sequence. That is the yoga sequence. It is the sequence of yoga that we follow in our sadhana. Now, in the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, this word asana simply means a comfortable seated position. It's interesting, the evolution of this word asana. And the Upanishads, for example, which predate the Yoga Sutras and were a great influence for Patanjali as he wrote the Yoga Sutras. In the Upanishads, this word asana really means your meditation seat, or the cushion that you use to sit on as you meditate. In the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, the word asana comes to mean our meditation posture. And there's really very few verses about asana in the Yoga Sutras. But essentially, we want to have a comfortable, upright, seated posture. So it is not recommended to lay down to meditate. Many of my students ask me, "Oh, can I please lay down to meditate?" I guess it's possible, but in our tradition, it just isn't done. And really, in the yoga tradition, if you're going to lay down, that's more of a relaxation technique, shavasana or yoga nidra or something like that, which is also very helpful and very, very useful. However, when we lay down, we have a tendency to become a little bit too relaxed. And there's a lot of confusion about meditation. Many people think that it is a relaxation technique. Relaxation is more of a side effect of meditation. It's a wonderful side effect, and it does relax our entire system, every layer of our being, all of the koshas. But it isn't a very alert relaxation. So the difference between lying down and sitting up is that when we lie down, we tend to over relax and we're not alert and aware enough. So we want to be fully alert, fully present as we meditate. So it's very important to find a comfortable, upright, seated position that we can use to meditate. Now, later on in the Hatha Yoga tradition, and with the Nath Yoga and Hatha Yoga tradition, this word asana came to mean all of the postures. All of the postures that people practice now. So oftentimes when we hear this word asana, we immediately think of downward facing dog or tree pose or cobra, or all of the asanas that we now use and that are listed in the texts of Hatha Yoga, like the Hatha Yoga Pradipika, Garunda Samhita, Shiva Samhita, etc. However, for Patanjali, that's not what he was talking about or referring to. When he spoke of asana, he was referring to a comfortable, upright, seated position that we use for the purposes of our pranayama and meditation practice. So we sit comfortably upright. That's the first step in the yoga sequence of Patanjali. Many people prefer to sit on the floor in a cross-legged position or in lotus or half lotus. And that's fine if people prefer that. It's not necessary. Some yogis will say that there are certain energetic benefits of the lotus posture, for example, as we meditate. It's possible, although personally I've experimented with many meditation postures, and I don't find that I meditate any better in lotus than I do just sitting in a chair. And of course, Mr. Davis sat in a chair for many decades as part of his meditation practice. It seemed to work out pretty well for him. So I don't think it's all that necessary to sit in the floor cross-legged unless you're more comfortable that way. That's totally fine. If you do sit in a chair, it is recommended to keep a little bit of space in between your back and spine and your chair. And this is because we have these subtle energetic channels that run along the spine called the nadis in the yoga tradition. And there are many nadis, but three in particular that are considered key or very important in our tradition. The Ida Nadi along the left side, the Pingala Nadi along the right side, and of course the Sushumna Nadi in the center that runs along our spine, our astral spine. And as we practice pranayama, especially Kriya pranayama, but even with nadi shodhana, with alternate nostril breathing, we begin to feel the subtle currents and flows of prana, vital energy, in these channels. And especially during Kriya pranayama. And so we want to have a little bit of space in between our back and the chair in which we meditate, so that we can feel these subtle currents occurring as we practice pranayama and meditation. So we sit comfortably with a nice straight spine so that these currents can flow more easily, more freely. And most people have to experiment with a few different meditation postures before they find something that is agreeable and that works for them well. So once we're comfortably seated, we move on to the next step, which is pranayama. Pranayama is a combination of two words, prana and ayama. And prana is our vital energy or astral energy, subtle energy. And ayama means expansion or movement. And so there's a common error in the translation of this word, pranayama. Many people translate it as the control of prana, or even breath control. However, when in Sanskrit, when you have a word that ends in A and another word that begins in A and you combine them, you cut off one of the A's. So it's actually not a combination of the words prana and yama. Yama does mean control, just as in the words yama and niyama. So this word yama does in fact mean control. However, pranayama is a combination of the words prana and ayama. And ayama means expansion or movement. And so we can define pranayama as the expansion and movement of prana or vital energy via breathing techniques or breathing exercises that we do. And so many people define pranayama as simply breathing exercises. But really, it's a little bit more than that. So it's actually the expansion and movement of prana via breathing techniques or breathing exercises that we perform in order to free up the movement of our prana. Generally, so that we can elevate the prana, so that we can bring the prana up toward the higher chakras, so that we can experience enlightened states of consciousness or elevated states of consciousness. Generally, the prana is not flowing freely, especially in the Sushumna Nadi. Typically, it is flowing more dominantly or predominantly in either Ida Nadi or Pingala Nadi. And this creates a state of imbalance. So you can think of a scale, and when you put more weight on this side of the scale, it weighs it down and it's moving in this direction. Or if it has more weight on this side, it's moving in that direction. So this imbalance, when we have more prana in Ida or Pingala, either one, it creates movement. So this imbalance, energetic imbalance, creates movement, which then creates vrittis. So vrittis are fluctuations or movements or changes, wave-like movements, vibrations that can distract us from meditation. Okay? And in chapter 1, Sutra 2, in Patanjali, we have the famous verse, Yoga Chitta Vritti Nirodha, right? Which means that yoga or samadhi occurs when the vrittis or fluctuations in our being cease. So when we're able to calm and pacify these fluctuations or changes or vibrations that are occurring, we can experience our true nature as pure, unbounded, unlimited, infinite consciousness. And so really, we practice the various steps of Patanjali to pacify, to calm, to minimize, to decrease the vrittis that are occurring in each layer of our being. In the Upanishads, in the Taittiriya Upanishad, which is an Upanishad from 900 years BC, predating Patanjali by 700 years, we have the cosmology of the 5 koshas or Panchakosha. And in this text, it lays out the cosmology of the 5 koshas, which are the 5 layers of our being that cover up the Atman or soul, which is pure infinite consciousness. And these 5 layers that cover up our being are the Annamaya kosha, which is the physical body, and it's the densest layer. It has the most density of all the layers. The next is the Pranamaya kosha, which is the energetic layer of our body, or the astral body, the subtle body, composed of chakras and nadis and such. Next, we have the Manomaya kosha, and the Manomaya kosha is the mental layer of our being. And the next is the Vijnanamaya kosha, and Vijnanamaya is essentially our identity or ego. And the last one is called Anandamaya kosha, and this is the layer of bliss, where we begin to experience the bliss of divine union. All of these layers are vibratory. They all have vibration, they all vibrate. The Atman, or the soul, pure consciousness, does not vibrate. It has no vibration. So, in every layer of our being, in all 5 of the koshas, it is possible to experience vrittis, or vibrations, that distract us when we are trying to concentrate and meditate. And so, sometimes the word chitta is translated in that verse as mind. But really, we need a more holistic translation or concept for chitta. Because as we meditate, we do not only experience vrittis in the mental layer, in the Manomaya kosha, we can experience vrittis or vibrations or distractions in the physical body. If our shoulder hurts or our back hurts or we have a headache, those are physical vrittis that we can experience. Okay? Likewise, we can easily experience emotional vrittis or energetic vrittis that occur in our Pranamaya kosha, which is the energetic layer of our being. So chitta, when we translate it as mind, it's really not all inclusive. We need to be thinking about all 5 koshas, all 5 layers of our being, and the fact that we can experience vrittis in any of those layers as we meditate. Because all of those layers are vibratory, they're all vibrating. Everything in Maya or manifestation is vibratory. It's all vibrating, it's all moving, changing constantly, never stops. And through deep meditation, superconscious meditation, we can experience ourselves as that which does not vibrate, that which does not change, that which has no vibration, that which doesn't move. And so we actually practice each step in Patanjali's sequence to minimize and decrease and pacify the vrittis that are occurring in each layer of our being, one at a time. It's a beautiful science. It's very logical, makes a lot of sense. And we are able to repeat the results. If we practice these things regularly, we will have repeated results, which is very scientific, isn't it? So we begin with asana. Okay. Now, if you want to include some other asanas beforehand to relax the body, especially the spine and the back, which tends to tense up or get tight as we meditate and sit for long periods of time, you should do that. However, it is not necessary to practice an hour-long, complicated sequence of asanas in order to prepare the body to meditate. You can just do some simple stretching for 10 minutes to prepare the spine and body to sit for a long period of time. So we start with asana. To relax, to calm, to pacify, to minimize the vrittis occurring in the Annamaya Kosha, or the body, the physical layer of our being. Then we move to Pranayama, and we can practice some Pranayama techniques to minimize or decrease the vrittis that are occurring in our Pranamaya Kosha, in the energetic layer of our being, which would be energetic happenings or emotions. Emotions are energetic in nature. And so we practice pranayama to calm and pacify the energetic layer of our being, the pranamaya kosha. Also, as we practice pranayama, we activate the parasympathetic side of our nervous system, which elicits the relaxation response. And when we practice nadi shodhana, alternate nostril breathing, we can balance the flows that are occurring in the Ida nadi and the Pingala nadi. Okay? Typically, we have one nostril that is dominant for 2 or 3 hours, and then it changes. Every 2 or 3 hours, our dominant nostril changes. In other words, we breathe deeper out of the right nostril for 2 or 3 hours, and then it changes to the left nostril for 2 or 3 hours. This is always occurring. You can witness this for yourself. And this means that we have our prana flowing predominantly in the Ida nadi or the Pingala nadi. Ida is our feminine, lunar, somatic side, and Pingala is the masculine, solar, Agni side. Okay, so we want to bring balance and equilibrium to the flows occurring in the nostrils and also in Ida and Pingala nadi. Because when we have balance and equilibrium, we have stillness. So where there is balance, where there is equilibrium, there is stillness, there is no movement. And so we practice pranayama techniques to create this energetic stillness and this energetic balance so that there are fewer vrittis occurring in our pranamaya kosha, in our energetic layer or astral body. We are also able, through the practices of pranayama, especially Kriya pranayama, we are able to bring our energy, our prana, and attention to the higher chakras. Normally, in our day-to-day lives, our attention and prana is in the lower chakras. Especially now with everything that's happening in the world, there are a lot of people, probably the vast majority, that seem to be existing in their lower chakras. And so through this practice of Kriya pranayama, we are able to elevate the prana and draw it up into the higher centers so that we can elicit higher states of consciousness and awareness, elevated or enlightened states of consciousness and awareness. So that is another purpose of pranayama. So we practice pranayama. And then the next step in Patanjali's sequence is Pratyahara. Now, Pratyahara has various translations. The retirement of the senses, for example. But I prefer the internalization of attention and prana. The internalization of attention and prana. Generally, our attention is flowing outward toward the senses and the objects of the senses, and also toward our thoughts, desires, emotions, memories, etc. So our attention and prana, which are linked, are typically flowing outward, and we're outward directed. And so we want to reverse this flow and internalize the attention and awareness. And through the practice of pranayama, if we practice it correctly, pratyahara follows organically and naturally. In other words, we don't have to practice a specific technique to internalize our attention and awareness if we practice pranayama properly and correctly. It just follows organically and naturally after our practice of pranayama, especially Kriya pranayama. And Lahiri Mahashaya talks about this in his commentary on the Bhagavad Gita, for example, that if we practice pranayama correctly, essentially pratyahara just occurs, just happens naturally, organically, without effort. However, there are some things that we can do to improve our practice and experience of pratyahara. For example, it is recommended to meditate in a dark room, a darkened space, and also a quiet space without distractions, so that we can more easily internalize our attention. It's not a coincidence that yogis for thousands of years have practiced in caves. For anyone who has ever been in a cave, one of the first things that you notice is that it's really quiet. There's no noise and there's no wind blowing. And it's dark. So the yogis did this in order to practice pratyahara, which is the internalization of attention, awareness, prana. It's far easier to practice this in a cave, or in a quiet, dark place without distractions. So that's pratyahara. The next step is dharana. And dharana means concentration However, it is typically associated with specific techniques of concentration. For example, observing the breath, mantra, the repetition of a mantra, visualizations. Some traditions like to visualize a specific yantra or sacred symbol to concentrate. In our tradition, there are various forms of dharana. For example, the inner light or jyoti. We can merge our attention and awareness fully with this inner light as a technique of dharana or concentration. Omkar Kriya, or listening for Om, also known as Nada Yoga or Shabda Yoga. We can listen intently for this sound or sacred primordial vibration and merge our attention and awareness fully with it as a means to concentrate. Some people like to stare at a candle flame with open eyes. That's another form of dharana. When I first started meditating, I meditated at the Atlanta Soto Zen Center when I was 15. Excuse me. I didn't know anything about meditation, but I had read some books and thought I would go try it out. And they meditate with open eyes. They keep their eyes open as they meditate, and they stare at a wall. And that is their only form of dharana or concentration, just to stare at a wall, which didn't appeal to me at 15 years old. So, and I had no basis for comparison at that time. I thought that was meditation. I didn't have anything to compare it to. And at any rate, so that's another form of dharana that one can practice. So we can practice dharana with our eyes open as well. And so we use these concentration techniques to focus the mind, to calm the mind, to pacify and calm and relax and minimize the vrittis that are occurring in the manomaya kosha, or the mental layer of our being. But the key with dharana, with any technique that we're using, is that we use the technique until it is no longer necessary. Now, what does that mean? We use the technique until we experience a clear, superconscious, largely thought-free state of pure awareness, where we can concentrate without the need of a technique to concentrate. So many talk to many students. They tell me that they're meditating, and I ask them what they're doing. Oh, well, I repeat a mantra for 20 minutes, or I observe my breath, 15 minutes, or I practice with a guided relaxation or a guided visualization, which is fine, which is all well and good, but that's not meditation. So we have to understand that dharana is not jhana, which is the next step, which is meditation, superconscious meditation. A technique is not meditation. Yeah, there's a lot of confusion around that. Mantra is not meditation. Watching the breath is not meditation. These are techniques of dharana or concentration, and they're very useful, but to a point, up to a point. So we want to practice with these concentration techniques so that we pacify and minimize the vrittis occurring in the manomaya kosha, or the mental layer of our being, so that we can concentrate fully without the need of a technique. Now, this requires practice. sometimes months of diligent, devoted sadhana and practice to begin to experience these thought-free, clear states of consciousness that occur as the technique fades away organically of its own volition. So we never want to force the technique away. It's an organic, natural process that occurs as we use the technique. It begins to fade away and become unnecessary, and we are left in this beautiful, peaceful, tranquil, peaceful state of pure awareness, where we can concentrate without the need to do anything or use anything. Sometimes the next step, jhana, is translated as uninterrupted concentration, meaning it's pure concentration without a technique. Yeah. Now, especially when we start, especially for beginners, when they begin meditating, they may experience a few seconds of thought-free awareness, and then the vrittis return and the distractions return. Well, then you have to return to your technique again for a time, and that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. So we use the technique, dharana, until we experience jhana, which is this superconscious state of thought-free, pure awareness. And then perhaps the vrittis and distractions return, and we return ourselves with minimal effort again to whatever technique we're using for a time until we again experience this superconscious transcendental state of pure awareness, pure existence being. And it's like that. So we kind of flow in and out of dharana and jhana as we practice. And that's okay. That's normal. Now, with practice, we can begin to experience these thought-free states for much longer periods. They last much longer. And we no longer need these concentration techniques to get us to a place where we can meditate. But typically this takes months, if not years of practice. And so dharana is concentration, usually with a technique of concentration. And then we experience the next step, which is jhana. And so we use pratyahara and dharana to transcend the manomaya kosha, or the mental layer. Now, jhana we use to transcend the vijnanamaya kosha, which is the layer of identity or ego, this sense of separation, this sense of individuality, this sense of I am Chris. It's this false self that we are identified with, that is the cause of all of our problems. We identify with the name and the form and the body and all of its likes and dislikes and our job and face and so on and so forth. And this is the beginning of all of our suffering and ignorance, isn't it? And so we practice all of these techniques so that we can reach a state where we are no longer identified with this false self that is the cause of all of the problems in our lives. We suffer because we are identified with the person that suffers. we experience suffering because we identify with the person that is suffering. When we are able to correct this error, there's no suffering. We're no longer identified with this temporary person, this temporary role that we're currently playing. And so, in these thought-free states of superconsciousness, jhana, many wonderful things begin to happen. Our lives improve. We're generally more peaceful, tranquil, less reactive. Sometimes we begin to see an inner light, not just when we're meditating, but almost all the time. The jyoti. We begin to hear more strongly, more clearly, the Om vibration. Our brain can begin to produce something called soma, or amrita, that we can begin to feel in every cell of the body. And it's like a subtle ambrosia or ecstasy that you can feel nearly all the time. And this comes about as a result of repeated superconscious states. The next step, or final step, in the 8 limbs or 8 steps of Ashtanga Yoga is samadhi, or yoga, or oneness consciousness, or union. There are various, I should say also that there are various levels of superconsciousness that one can experience. There are various levels or stages of jhana that one can experience. Many refined, subtle stages. Likewise with samadhi, or oneness consciousness, there are various levels or stages of samadhi also that we can experience. One is Savikalpa Samadhi, which is typically translated as samadhi with support, or supported samadhi. In this state, we do lose identity with the false self, but we experience union with something, with an object. For example, the Om vibration, or the inner light. And in one moment, we experience, I am Om. And there's no identification with Chris. There's only this union with an object of our contemplation. It doesn't have to be Om or the inner light. It can be anything, really. That is not the ultimate aim of our practice. However, it is useful because we do begin to sever this identity with the false self. And there is no sense of separation, which is really nice. Beyond that is Nirvikalpa Samadhi, which is samadhi without support, where we experience union, oneness consciousness, real oneness, real union, where there is no subject or object. And of course, the mind cannot understand how can that be so? How can there, of course, there's separation in between me as the subject and whatever I'm experiencing as the object. So samadhi is, we can say, a mystical, ineffable experience. In other words, it cannot be described with words, but it is the ultimate aim of our practice. But we should note that it is a temporary experience. Unfortunately, it does not last. Sometimes it lasts for a few seconds, sometimes for a few minutes, if we're very lucky, a few hours. For very, very advanced yogis, it could last days. But typically, always really, we return to our identity or identification with this smaller, limited sense of self. So Patanjali in the Yoga Sutras, for example, says that samadhi is not permanent, lasting enlightenment or self-realization. And he says that actually, what is really needed is repeated episodes of samadhi. So in other words, he says that we need to repeat this experience of samadhi often to experience a more stable, permanent, lasting state of self-knowing, self-realization, which is the ultimate aim of our practice. And in samadhi, we transcend all of the koshas, all of the vibratory layers of our being. We experience ourselves as pure, unbounded, omnipresent consciousness that does not vibrate, does not change, that does not suffer, and that does not die. And we have a few minutes left here. If anyone has a question for me, I'd be happy to give it a shot. Not promising anything, but you can raise your hand or unmute yourself and just call out if you want to. All right. I must have been crystal clear. That's good. That's good news. Well, it was a joy to share this time with you. For those of you that I've met, it's really wonderful to see you and share this time and this virtual space with you. And thank you so much for your participation. Oh, thank you, Walter and Wilma. Yeah, good to see you guys too. Thank you so much.
Chris, you will.
Thank you so much. Lots of love to all of you.